Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again. Tonight's lecture is going to be looking at the second half of unit number 2, which is population and migration. Tonight, we begin migration. So let's go ahead and get started. To begin with, before we even start with migration, let's start off with different ways that people move. So talking about different types of movement. Basically, this entire slide is just definitions, a little bit of math there at the end. But for this first part, just definitions, so make sure that you're underlining important parts of these definitions, narrowing it down to just a couple of really key words that will help you remember what these words are all about. So here we go, mobility. All types of movement from one location to another, including temporary travel and migration. So just based off this first definition, I want you to try and see if you guess what the definition of migration is. It says including temporary travel and migration. So based off of that, what do you think migration is going to be? Let's see if you're right later on down the slide. So a couple of things that fall within mobility. One thing we want to definitely talk about is activity space, the space within which daily activity occurs, not unusual exceptions. So when you think about it as a student, a high school student, your activity space is probably going to include your house, the school, maybe a couple places that you go on a fairly regular basis. If you play a sport, maybe there's a particular field or court that you go to. If you attend religious services, maybe there's a particular place that you go on a fairly regular basis. So that's what we're talking about, the activity space, the space within which your daily activity kind of occurs. And then we also need to mention periodic movements. Periodic movements include temporary, recurrent relocation. And they give us some examples there, college attendance and military service. You're not permanently relocating. It's periodic. It's temporary, but might happen on a regular basis. For those students in college, they might attend a college campus in a different part of the state or a different part of the country, and then they come back home during breaks and things like that. And maybe after graduation, they come back home. Or maybe after graduation, they decide to stay there, at which point it now has become permanent, which now leads to our next definition. Migration, form of relocation diffusion involving the permanent or relatively permanent. It might not be forever, but you're not planning to go back anytime soon. You're not planning to go anyplace else sometime soon. So relatively permanent. Relocation of an individual or group to a new place of residence. So that is what this entire chapter is all about, is about the permanent relocation of an individual or group to a new place. And so we're going to talk about all the different kinds of decision making that goes into it, as well as different things associated with that. Two major types of migration that we have to be familiar with. We have emigration and immigration. Emigration, you see that there? It's E and then migration. Migration from a location, out migration. I always look at emigration and go, it's a place is becoming more empty. Emigration, E, empty. They're leaving. It's becoming more empty. And then you have immigration, I migration. Migration to a new location, that is in migration, and it kind of has it right there in the title, immigration in migration. So that's how I remember it. Whatever way will help you remember it is really what this is about. But you got to remember the difference between emigration and immigration, two very important definitions. And then we have net migration, difference between in migration and out migration in an area. And so this was that math that we were talking about just a couple minutes ago. When emigration, that is out migration, exceeds immigration, you have net out migration. So more people leaving than coming in, your country or region, county, whatever it might be, has net out migration. And then you have If immigration, that is in migration, exceeds out migration, more people coming in than going out, then you're going to have net in migration. You definitely want to make sure that you're familiar with that kind of formula. It's not super difficult, it's not super sophisticated, but make sure that you're able to articulate how that works. So now let's take a look at this. So what we have here is a map of net migration. Now, the shading on this is not super intuitive, so let's make sure that we understand what we're looking at. We have different shades of red, which constitute different levels of in-migration, where more people are coming in than going out. Then the lighter shade of purple is going to be basically no net migration, that the number of people going in and the number of people going out, roughly the same. Population in that country doesn't really change as a result of migration. And then the darker shades of purple, that dark shade of purple, going to have net out migration. You got more people leaving than coming in. So let's ask the usual questions. First off, what type of map are we looking at? At what scale? And now, is this a good indicator of development? And I would say not really, but there definitely is some important development characteristics to pay attention to. For example, take a look at North America. Mexico has net out migration, more people leaving than coming in to Mexico. And the US and Canada have net in migration, fairly high net in migration. So this is something where we are going to see some levels of development factor into this. For example, again, take a look at Europe. Eastern Europe, which is less developed, we'd say probably semi-periphery, has net out migration, whereas Russia, which is also semi-periphery, but much of Western Europe has net in migration. So we do see an element of lower levels of development leaving and heading to areas of higher levels of development. To a certain extent, it's definitely not a complete. It's definitely not a universal characteristic, because we see some areas like Somalia, Sudan, Afghanistan with net in migration. So those are some of those outliers that we look for, and the ones that we might say, okay, what's going on there? What's the specific situation there that's leading to that? And those are really good geographic questions to ask. Next slide, we're back to a couple of our different definitions for this unit. So let's again review, making sure that we understand the definitions. First one is transnational migration. On our vocabulary list, that shows up as international migration. Just be aware that transnational and international mean the same thing. You're crossing an international border. You're crossing a national border. And that's really what trans means, is crossing. So if you've ever heard of the Transcontinental Railroad, it was crossing a continent. Transnational migration is migration that takes place across national borders. And so when we take a look at the definition, permanent movement from one country to another. Internal migration is going to be permanent movement within a country. Then we have a couple different types of migration that lead us to different places. First one is chain migration. Migration of people to a specific location because relatives, friends, or members of the same nationality previously migrated there. Great example of that in my own personal life. I moved here from Michigan when I was 8 years old. Part of the reason why my parents chose Las Vegas to move to was because we already had some family here. And if you think about in your own personal life, are there any examples that you can draw from? And really great connection to a later unit, we haven't gotten there yet, but we will talk about this again, is that chain migrations create, and this is a good thing to write down, ethnic enclaves. Ethnic enclaves. And ethnic enclaves are, and you've probably heard of, parts of the city that are referred to by this before. Things like Chinatown, Little Italy. Part of the reason why those areas gathered those names were because so many people of a particular nationality migrated there. And the main reason that many people migrated to those areas is because they already knew people, or they had family, or there were other people who spoke the same language or practiced the same religion, had the same cultural background. And so that draws people to a particular area. So we're going to define ethnic enclaves later this year when we actually get to our culture unit. But for right now, know that chain migration is connected to that. All right. Our next one that we have on here is steppe migration. Steppe migration is migration to a distant location that occurs in stages. So the example that I like to use with this one, if we had a family who is moving, let's say a Brazilian family who is moving from a very small rural village to a slightly larger town, and then finally to Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro, very big city. All right, those proceed in steps and occur over time. Uh, Now, this is something that is becoming a little less common with globalization, because people are able to move further distances as a product of space-time compression. Um, and we'll talk about when people move very large distances next unit or next lecture. But for right now, just know that some of these do proceed in steps, and we'll take a look at why that is here in just a couple minutes. Next one that we have is seasonal agricultural migration. Great example of this. It's one of our vocabulary units in both this unit as well as in agriculture. It's called transhumanance. Transhumanance is a seasonal, periodic movement, so not permanent. It's seasonal. It goes by the seasons, of pastoralists and their livestock between highland and lowland pastures. And typically what we see is that during the summer months, they will head to the highland areas where it's a little bit cooler. And then during the winter months, they will head to the lowland pastures, because typically during the winter months, those highland areas are going to be very, very cold. They're going to get precipitation in the form of snow, not in rain. Really what they're doing is following the greenery, following where that grass is going to be for the livestock. And then finally on here we have rural to urban migration. Make sure that you know what rural and urban mean. Rural typically is associated with agrarian lifestyles. Typically it's going to be out in what we might say the countryside. A lot of times associated with agriculture in the primary sector, so it could be mining or lumbering. And then urban means city lifestyle. And later this unit, a couple lectures from now, we'll talk about the difference between urbanization, suburbanization, and counter-urbanization. And it deals with the different combinations of rural to urban, or vice versa, types of migration. Two very broad categories of migration are voluntary and forced. One is voluntary, it is elective, someone is choosing to migrate. The other one is forced, it is involuntary. Someone is not making that choice. It is being forced upon them. So let's understand a couple of things that we have here. Voluntary migration is going to be defined as permanent movement undertaken by choice. It is when someone makes the choice to migrate. Now remember, this must be permanent. So if we were using as an example guest workers or another group of workers called time contract workers, people who are on a specific contract to work for a period of time, they are not included in voluntary migration numbers because it is not going to be a permanent move. And probably one of the largest factors that influences voluntary migration is going to be economics. Economics drives a lot of voluntary migration. Forced migration is defined as permanent migration flows in which the movers have no choice but to relocate, usually compelled by cultural factors. Included in there would be a lot of violence, it would be conflict, it would be war. Those are included as part of cultural factors, but we'll explain that here in just a couple minutes. A couple examples, historical examples that would fall under forced migration. The Atlantic arm of the triangle trade, or the Atlantic slave trade, is a good example of forced migration. We're going to see it when we look at some of the biggest modern migrations in human history. We're going to look at that. And that is an example of a forced migration. People were kidnapped from their homes, they were sold into slavery and forced across the Atlantic, not of their own choosing. Another example in U.S. history is actually the forced relocation of Native Americans from the southeastern part of the United States into the Great Plains region. This took place during the 1820s under the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Many of you might have heard of the Trail of Tears, and that's what this is referring to. This was a forced relocation of Native Americans. Now, one really important note to make about forced relocation and forced migrations is that it doesn't actually have to be someone standing there saying, "You must move." It doesn't have to be that. It can be someone fearing for their lives, fearing for their safety, fearing for their family, and believing that there is no other option but to move. That fear drives people to leave. And when you're faced with the choice of, if I stay, I might die, but I might be able to save myself by leaving, that's still going to be classified as a forced migration, because people aren't making the choice, well, I'd like to continue living. That's not a voluntary decision. That's something that we are forced, that's a decision that people are forced to make. So we have to understand that, just as a reminder. So now let's take a look at the process with which migration kind of happens. And we actually have a model for this. This is called Lee's model of migration. Now, I don't know that you're ever going to see on the AP exam a question that specifically refers to Lee's model of migration, but it is something that helps you understand how and why people move permanently. And so you have to understand the underlying principles of Lee's model of migration. The name probably isn't so much something that you would necessarily need to know, but it doesn't hurt. So just to kind of make sure that you understand that. So first off, we have some key vocabulary terms that we, again, have to be familiar with. The first one is push factors. Push factors are reasons to move from a particular place. They push us from one place. Right? Push factors pushing us away. Then you've got pull factors, reasons to move to another place. And I always have kind of this visual of someone pulling a rope. Same kind of thing that we could make the association with chain migration. Someone's pulling a chain to a particular place. Family pulling you to a particular place, chain migration. In this case, reasons to move to a particular place. And chain migration would be a good example of a pull factor. You already have family there. Intervening obstacles are an environmental or cultural feature of the landscape that hinders migration. That is, slows it down, makes it more difficult. People can still get past it, perhaps, but it slows it down, makes it more difficult. And then you have intervening opportunities, presence of a near opportunity that greatly diminishes the attractiveness of sites further away. And so intervening opportunity is something comes up. You get a better opportunity along the way. You thought making it to a particular place, city, or a country that's further away would be the most desirable, but then during the journey you realize that there's an opportunity that is just as good, perhaps before you get to that other place. So let's take a look at a visual that corresponds with this. So here's what we have. This is Lee's model of migration. And just make sure that you understand the different elements. So each of the boxes on the left and right, those are going to be our source region. That's where people begin. And then you have the destination, where people are headed. Well, the source region is going to be made up of push factors. Now, remember, push factors push us away. So if we were to think of this in kind of a visual format, push factors, would they be positives or negatives? They're pushing us to leave, positives or negatives, right? So they push us to leave, we migrate. That's the arrow. Where are we headed? Well, we're headed to our destination because they have pull factors. Again, positives or negatives. They're pulling us to a particular location. And then during the course of this migration, there's going to be some kind of intervening obstacle. So this is what Lee's model of migration actually looks like. So make sure that you have those associations built in there, and there's a couple different visuals that we could see. For example, here is a much more simplified version of Lee's model. You have a push factor or several push factors that force you to migrate, that leads to a new destination that you are drawn to by pull factors. All right, and so we could just call this, as you see up there, the push-pull mechanism. So when it comes to push and pull factors, we have three major categories that we have to be aware of. Economic, which we pointed out a few minutes ago, is typically associated with voluntary migrations. People move for new jobs, better wages, better benefits, things like that. A lot of times, voluntary migration is driven by economic decisions. Environmental, as well as cultural. Now, remember we said a couple minutes ago, again, economic tends to be associated more with voluntary migration. Cultural elements, or probably better to phrase it as most forced migrations derive out of the cultural category. So violence, warfare, civil war, conflict, political strife, all of that falls under the cultural umbrella. There are some forced migrations that do derive out of the environmental push and pull factor. Natural disasters are a great example of a forced migration that is of an environmental push or pull factor. And so there's kind of a spectrum there. Economic typically is with voluntary. Most forced migrations do come or derive out of the cultural category, and then environmental kind of in between. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. So here's what I'd like you to do on this slide, is that for each one that I read, I'd like you to identify it as economic, environmental, or cultural. So like next to each one, go ahead and put like an EC if it's economic, an EV if it's environmental, and a C if it's cultural. So let's go through each one of these. And this is just a sampling. I'm going to ask you to come up with a couple examples of your own on both sides to see how we do. So here's what we've got. Push factors: unemployment, lack of safety, lack of services, poverty, crop failure, drought, war, civil unrest, hazards, isolation. So which of those economic, which were environmental, which were cultural? And some might be a little bit easier, some might be a little bit more challenging. Then what I want you to do is come up with a couple examples, at least one example that is economic, that's not on here, an example that is environmental, that is not on here, and an example that is cultural, that is not on here. Push factors: pushing people away, driving people to leave their homes. And then you have pull factors. So we have potential for employment, a safer atmosphere, better service provision, greater wealth, fertile land, good food supplies, political security, less risk of natural hazards, friends and family. So again, which were economic, which were environmental, and which were cultural. And then, again, come up with an additional example that is economic, an economic pull, an environmental pull, and a cultural pull. Go ahead and pause the video if you need to come up with a few of those, because the reality is that on the AP exam, they may ask you, which of the following is an environmental pull, which of the following is an economic push, and it might not be this exhaustive list. it might be something that you have to think about. So you want to think outside the box a little bit and say, okay, is it going to be more economic or environmental or cultural, and how would we classify that? If it deals with money, it's probably more economic. If it deals with the physical environment, it's probably more environmental. And then a lot of everything else deals with cultural. So think about it. And so thus far, we haven't really talked about intervening obstacles and opportunities. So let's take a look at each using economic, environmental, and cultural as examples. So some examples of intervening obstacles, remember these hinder migration. They slow us down. They serve as obstacles. Environmental is a really easy one for this. Any kind of natural features that serve as barriers. Mountains, rivers, bodies of water, oceans, things like that could absolutely serve as this. A desert could serve as an environmental obstacle. It slows people down. Can people get across it? Well, of course they can. But it slows some people down. As far as cultural obstacles, if a country or a state has very strict laws regarding people coming in or perhaps leaving, that could serve as an obstacle. So, if you need a passport to leave or a visa to come in, that is something that most certainly could be part of the cultural element. And then obviously, if you run out of money during the course of your migration, then that would certainly be an economic obstacle. And again, try and come up with some other examples that might fit in, especially with the cultural one, because there's so many examples that we could come up with that would serve as cultural obstacles. Walls, for example, might serve as a cultural obstacle. It hinders migration. Now, we're not talking about right or wrong if they should be there or should they not be there. We're just talking about, does it slow people down? And it most certainly does. That's the reason that most walls are built, is to slow people down. Examples of opportunities, again, keeping with the same thing. Probably one of the biggest opportunities is going to be economic in nature, so new jobs arise. Environmental, somebody might discover a natural resource or a prime farmland during the course of their migration. On the cultural end of this, if someone is moving and they run into people who speak the same language, have the same backgrounds, practice the same religion, they run into an ethnic enclave, that might be where they end up staying. It wasn't where they intended to stay, but it might be where they end up. So let's take a look at the practical application of Lee's model. So again, we started out by saying that the source region drives people away, pushes people away. Those are negatives. And so people leave and they're headed to the destination. They're drawn to the destination because of those positives. And again, we should mention that a lot of times people are drawn to places because they have this idea in their head of what it's going to be. But we're going to see here in a minute, sometimes that isn't exactly the reality. All right. And during the course of this, they're going to run into some kind of obstacle. That was, again, the baseline of Lee's model. So let's add some practicality to this. Let's bring it to real life. Is every place ever all negatives or all positives for that matter? And if we really think about it, no, there's going to be positives and negatives of just about every place, no matter where it is. And so for the place that you're leaving, yeah, there might be negatives that are driving you away, but what are some positives that might keep you there, that might make it hard to leave? We call those, I call those anti-push factors. Now, that's not a formal AP Human Geography exam, but it's just, it's the opposite of push. It's something that is making it harder to pushing you away. And family is probably one of the biggest ones. It's hard to leave your family, to head off to someplace new. And so that's something, even if you're doing it for your family, it might be hard to do. And then on the destination side, you might be headed to a particular place because of the positives that you have in your head, but you're not thinking about some of the negatives that might exist in that place. And so I call those anti-pull factors. So the reality is that some people are going to hit that intervening obstacle and they're going to head back. Other times, people are going to come across an intervening opportunity. They're going to end up someplace else. And so an example that I like to use with this is, let's use the United States. Let's use local example. Someone is traveling from interior part of Latin America, let's say Guatemala. They're passing through Mexico on their way to the United States. And they're heading there because they're trying to earn money, send it back to their family. We call those remittances. It's one of our vocabulary terms. And so they're heading through Mexico. And during the course of their travels through Mexico on their way to the United States, they get into northern Mexico. They get near the U.S.-Mexico border. They run into the border fence that is along the southern border of the United States. Their only option, because they weren't prepared to enter legally, would be an illegal entrance, which is, by the nature of the name, illegal. And so that could potentially have repercussions of getting deported or getting put in jail. And so during the time that they're in northern Mexico, they discover that there are some higher paying jobs than what they're used to in their rural town in Guatemala, in maquiladora factories in northern Mexico. And we're going to talk about the maquiladoras later this year, and how the wages there are higher than in many other places in Mexico and interior parts of Central America. And so if someone is traveling through Guatemala into Mexico, through Mexico, and reach the northern part of Mexico, they might be drawn to another destination. They didn't plan on staying in Mexico in a maquiladora factory, but it serves the purpose of what they were trying to do, which was to make money and send it back to their family. And now they don't have the same, perhaps, challenges that might exist of crossing a border illegally and being in the United States illegally. And so that's just one hypothetical example of how this could play out. But the reality is this, that many people will migrate and relatively few people will arrive in their chosen destination. And so here's how Lee's model actually looks. Same thing that we saw earlier with the push-pull mechanism. It's not that simple. And so we see that there's positives and negatives of every place. And then there's neutral factors as well. And that during the course of this, there's going to be intervening obstacles, and that there's, positive, negative, and neutral factors of the destination. So it's a little bit more complicated than just, I don't want to be here anymore, so I'm going to go someplace else where it's all sunshine and rainbows. It's not really reality. And so there's a lot of different consequences of these different patterns of migration. So, for example, governments tend to respond to migration. We saw earlier that just about every place on Earth is going to have either some level of migration, whether that's in migration, out migration, or kind of neutral migration. And that doesn't remain static. That changes over time. And so governments tend to respond by encouraging migration. An example of a country that might need that or might encourage migrants to come to their country is if they're in the need of workers, if they need workers. And so I ask you guys, let's review a little bit of population. What stage of the demographic transition do you think a country would be in where they would want to be inviting people into their country to be workers? Why might they do that? What might the dependency ratio look like? What stage of the DTM are they in? So think about it. And same kind of question that I have down here. If a country is going to restrict migration, perhaps they're approaching their carrying capacity, perhaps they are, what stage of the DTM might they be in? And might it be multiple stages, and that they restrict based on the volume of migrants that are coming in? So there's a lot of moving parts with this. There's a lot of different elements that we have to consider. Obviously, when people move, migration is relocation diffusion. And so when people move, they bring with them the things that are part of their culture. That is language, that is religion. They bring ideas with them, innovations. Great example of that, the Silk Road, the diffusion of technology and ideas to different parts of the world. But in addition to that, when they move, they bring with them things that maybe aren't as positive, like diseases. And part of the Columbian Exchange, we have to mention the diseases that were exchanged. Obviously, there was a lot of diffusion of agricultural goods, of plants and animals between the old world and the new. But obviously, we have to mention, because just huge numbers of Native Americans succumbed to diseases that many people from the old world, Europe and Africa, had built up immunities to. And so we have to mention it as part of the Columbian Exchange. And then finally, I want to mention brain drain, which is a vocabulary term. It is the loss of a developing country's most educated citizens as they emigrate, that is, leave, in search of better educational and career opportunities in developed countries. So we're already starting to see there's migration from developing, that is LDC or periphery or semi-periphery, to core countries. And so that's brain drain, when a less developed country, a periphery or semi-periphery country, loses some of its most skilled individuals, or some of the most educated individuals, to a core country, perhaps to study at university or whatever it might be. But then if there's a brain drain, what is brain gain? If brain drain is an LDC, a periphery or semi-periphery country losing people who are very educated, how might you define brain gain? It's not an official definition in our vocabulary list, but I want you to think about it, because it could come up. You never know. But with that said, that's just something to think about for the end of tonight, and we will transition into a couple of major migration streams that we will see both in class and in our next online lecture. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. See you in class.